Anita Hill made headlines in 1991 when she testified about alleged sexual...
It takes an expert in psychology to explain how that can happen.
Anita Hill.
To Weinstein.
I believed Anita Hill.
Women are willing to stand up and tell their own stories and their own truth.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have a returning guest, Carol Murchison, out of New York and London. Carol, thank you so much for rejoining us here on Unshut Cases. It's great to have you back.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm Dan Taft, host of Unshut Cases. Carol is, of course, the cult assassin. She is of counsel at McAllister Oliverius. And as we touched on in our inaugural episode, the cult of Weinstein, we know that you have a long history of kind of investigating and working on these like cult cases and breaking those down. I know we kind of touched on it last time, but if you could kind of just give us a little bit of, an overview of your background with that and kind of how you've worked on employment law, labor law cases, sexual harassment cases, and some of the high profile ones, the Shambhala cult and everything like that.
So yes, I started out as an employment lawyer. So I represented companies, and through the era when sexual harassment actually became a thing, when it became something that we saw as a society, and that there were laws against. And so I did a lot of that kind of work, did investigations for companies into sexual misconduct allegations. And then I got drawn into doing a pro bono investigation on the allegations that there was sexual misconduct in a Buddhist community. That was Shambhala in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And that led from one thing to another, as they say. And then I eventually moved into litigating those cases because I found that that organizations in that space, in that kind of cult-like environment, did not want to hold themselves accountable for what had happened, and that the law was really the only tool that we had to make that happen. So I went back into litigation, and that's what I'm doing now, representing people who have been sexually assaulted in religious, spiritual communities.
Amazing. And you touched on talking about someone who wanted to escape accountability and kind of, not face up to what he's done. We're discussing a very interesting, high-profile historical case here today, the Clarence Thomas Senate hearings from 1991. Of course, Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. Thomas famously is the second African-American judge to serve on the Supreme Court, longest serving member since 2018, is also the court's oldest member, conservative Republican. Anita Hill was a law professor who worked under Clarence Thomas at the United States Department of Education and then at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. George H.W. Bush Sr. nominated Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court to replace Thurgood Marshall, who had announced his retirement. From the beginning, this was controversial due to Thomas's stance on abortion, affirmative action. Nomination was opposed by the NAACP, Urban League, and the National Organization for Women. Then all these sexual allegations start coming out, right? So towards the end of the nomination process, Anita Hill, who again worked with Thomas, the allegations were leaked to the media from a confidential FBI report, led to further investigations. Media frenzy about sexual harassment, televised hearings were reopened and held by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Before the nomination was moved to the full Democratic-controlled Senate for a vote, Anita Hill was called to testify during the hearing, where she said that during her employment, Thomas made sexually provocative statements.
1982, these began again. The comments were random and ranged from pressing me about why I didn't go out with him to remarks about my personal appearance. I remember his saying that someday I would have to tell him the real reason that I wouldn't go out with him. He began to show displeasure in his tone and voice and his demeanor, and his continued pressure for an explanation. He commented on what I was wearing in terms of whether it made me more or less sexually attractive. The incidents occurred in his inner office.
Said he spoke about acts that he had seen in pornographic films involving women having, bestiality, group sex, rape scenes. Also said he would tell her about his own personal sex life.
The name that he had been referred to in the pornographic material
Do you recall what it was?
Yes, I do. The name that was referred to was Long Dong Silver.
Then we had Angela Wright, who had worked for Thomas, came forward as well with similar allegations, although she was dismissed without testifying. Clarence Thomas testified the accusations against him were false. Others testified in support of him. Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States by a narrow Senate majority of 52 to 48, and he's been there ever since. So that's kind of the, the intro there to everything. I have a lot of questions for you, and obviously your expertise here I think is going to be super valuable. How did the media coverage handle these allegations, 30 plus years ago? And do you think it had any impact on the public's perception of this case and the outcome?
Let's start with the public perception of the case, if we can. So I remember watching the hearings. In fact, I think that over 85% of Americans watched some of these hearings.
Wow.
And I remember being at one point with my mother-in-law, who was in her late 80s at that time. And what she said to me is, of course this happened. This happened to every woman in the workplace. It happened to me.
Wow.
And so regardless of how the media covered it, I think that, I know that it had a huge impact on a kind of awakening something that had been lurking below the surface. And so I think that a great number of women recognized what Anita Hill was saying as having been an experience that many, many women had encountered in the workplace. And they believed her.
Yeah. And you touched on something interesting there, which is sort of like the normalization of abuse, really, is part of this sort of like patriarchal construct of the workplace and society for probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we're sort of now at this like reckoning moment where almost now kind of unraveling or kind of trying to, pull apart all this stuff that has just been sewn into the fabric of this for so long. And it's not okay and it's not normal. But to your point about your mother-in-law, it was like there was just these generations where it was like, oh, this is just how it is.
That's the way it is. And that is such an interesting point because it was so normal that if you go back to the hearings, and I remember hearing this or seeing this on television, Arlen Specter, who was a senator from Pennsylvania, who was a very moderate Republican, he actually said in the hearings, when they were questioning Professor Hill about what had been said, and he said to her, so you're telling us that he said to you that he liked women with large breasts. Well, that's not bad. That's something we say all the time.
You testified this morning that the most embarrassing question involved, this is not too bad, women's large breasts. That's a word we use all the time.
That's how normal it was.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Isn't it? To say that. And if you can imagine, but at the same time, think, Dan, about where we are now. When we saw and heard about the Trump E. Jean Carroll trial.
Yep. Trump's
lawyer said repeatedly, but you didn't scream. Because that was the normalization of that myth.
Right.
That it couldn't be rape if you didn't scream. For Arlen Specter and all of the men on that Senate committee, it was normal to talk about women with big breasts in the workplace. And when women heard that, I think I can only really speak for the people around me, but they were like, what the heck? Why is this still being allowed? So I think it just, a certain amount of anger arose at the way that she was treated, at Biden, who was the chairman of that committee, which I know he has regretted how she was treated, that Angela Wright was not called to testify because her testimony corroborated Anita Hill's testimony. Absolutely.
Yeah.
She didn't know Anita Hill. She didn't wish to come forward, but her testimony, I feel, would have persuaded a lot more people that what she was saying was true.
Yeah, it's interesting that she, was basically dismissed, right? Or not sort of allowed to kind of have that voice. Yeah, it seems both parties were reluctant to let her testify. And, so why was this? If she did testify, do you think it would have changed the actual outcome and the result of this?
Maybe not in the vote.
Yeah.
Dan, I think that sometimes that die is cast,
Yeah.
and
Right.
it might not have changed the vote, but it might have reached more people and who maybe wondered if what she was saying was true.
Yeah.
It might have said, oh, well, that's interesting. It's not so hard to dismiss when there's another person who comes forward with corroborating evidence. But I think that, they were in a difficult position
Mhm.
because the way that it was framed is if you believed an African American woman, then you were racist or against an African American man. So it was a very difficult position for politicians to be in.
Right. Yeah. The whole Angela Wright angle of it to me is something that I feel like is interesting and sort of not that it's not covered enough when this comes up, but because again, she didn't actually testify, it's like, it is a component of it that feels like it could have weighed much more heavily on this whole thing
Yes.
if she had cut,
Yes.
was able to actually testify. We saw something similar to this just a few years ago with Brett Kavanaugh when he was, elected or appointed to Supreme Court. How, if at all, do the differences between these two nominations show how things have changed over the last 20 years, or have they not changed that much over the last,
Well,
really, well, it's 30 years now, but yeah, obviously this was a few years back. But yeah, I mean, where are we now with, or a few years back with Brett Kavanaugh versus where we were 30 years ago?
yeah, I do. I think that the pessimistic part of me wonders whether we have changed because I think we saw some of the same themes,
Right.
in that, again, a woman who did not want to come forward, who didn't come forward to destroy someone, but who was, who had this experience. And I think, as in so many things that are political, as the Supreme Court nominations are, that we haven't changed. Maybe we've changed. We certainly have changed more in places that are outside of the political realm. I think we've changed more in public opinions. I think we've changed more in the workplace. In fact, I'm absolutely positive of it. We may not be where we want to be, but we have changed.
Right.
It's when we get to politicians that I really wonder whether we will ever change. I hope we will, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that we've changed in that regard.
It's interesting. It's like the last bastion of people who get away with this stuff. You're like, how? If this was any other
Yes,
thing, this
right.
person would be in prison, or somehow it's like it's like, wow, okay, so
Yeah.
they're above the law almost. It feels like
Right.
in a lot of these
And
cases.
I recall in that case vaguely that there were other women, once again, like the Angela Wright situation, who were not called. Now, the difference, I think you could say, is that there was a pause for an investigation, perhaps more weight given to Ms. Ford's testimony than was given to Anita Hill, but
Yeah.
the outcome was the same. For me, the outcome was the same in the sense that we had, as an investigator, as somebody who looks for corroborating evidence, to be able to determine whether it is more likely than not that something happened. And then I'm always wondering, why didn't we hear from the corroborating witnesses?
Right.
Because they didn't know one another. They were different circumstances. Wouldn't that have weighed heavily,
Yeah.
as it would have if it was in court?
Yeah, I mean, you would think so. And another kind of thing I wanted to ask you about in this case, some argue that since Anita Hill had dinners and phone calls with Thomas after her employment ended, that this was proof that she was, you know, fine or okay with his behavior. How would you respond to that idea?
Yeah, I will tell you exactly how I respond to it. It is sometimes, and this was said to me by one of my clients, and I've looked into it a great deal. It is often more dangerous to say no than it is to say yes. And what I mean by that in relationship to Anita Hill, it was dangerous for her not to maintain at least a civil, cordial relationship with Thomas,
Right.
because her career in many ways depended upon it. And so it would be dangerous to not do that. It's ridiculous to me that this is, it certainly isn't ridiculous that it was being said in 1991, but it's ridiculous that it's being said even, today, when we know that people have to do what they have to do. Life is hard enough, right? You have a career, you want a job, you're getting a paycheck, you're living on it, you're raising children on it. It's why we have workplace harassment laws.
Yeah.
It's because people should be allowed to go to work and work
Right.
and not have to be harassed. And so that she kept up a distant relationship with him, I believe many, many women will tell you who have been in the same position, they would do the same thing. They would do exactly the same thing, because it's more dangerous to kind of shut him down than it is to simply go along.
Right. It's survival instinct almost.
Yes,
career
it is.
survival instinct. Yeah. Clarence Thomas, in his testimony, insinuated that his race was behind the allegations.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you. You will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
Was there any merit to that argument, or was that him just trying to sort of, again, deflect from any accountability here and sort of, was it more strategic, do you think, on his part?
Well, it could certainly have been strategic, but it's not a stretch to say that race played a huge part in the nomination. That we are just now recently seeing more people of color, coming up into these positions. So I think that it is certainly always a question for people of color. Is this because of race?
Sure.
But of course, Anita Hill is a woman of color. And so that, I think, is what made it a particularly difficult position for politicians to be in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Why were so many organizations like the NAACP, like the National Organization for Women, against Clarence Thomas's nomination even before the allegations? Because I believe there was pushback around him as a candidate, before Anita Hill this stuff even surfaced. So what was some of that about?
I think politics. He was obviously he was a very conservative nomination. He is still a conservative in his opinions. And so I think that we could see even in 1991, the issues like abortion that have played out in these, in 2022.
Right.
So I think a lot of it was politics, in that we were beginning to see the era where Supreme Court nominees it was not just about their qualifications, it was about their politics.
Or their ideology. In 2021, proof of text between Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny, and Trump's chief of staff were released and showed her support for the Stop the Steal movement and the January 6th, the insurrection. Should this merit Thomas being left out of any cases related to these issues? Just the idea of, his wife sort of doing these things kind of behind the scenes, but obviously, being a powerful person. What's your perception on that, just from like a legal standpoint?
From a legal standpoint, what we know is that the Supreme Court doesn't have any rules about ethics. From a personal standpoint, what I feel is that they need to have rules about ethics, just like every other judge in any other court in the United States. And so I think they're having to kind of reckon with that, and also with the issue of whether they should recuse themselves. So I think we're seeing with Alito now. Yes, right. Alito's wife, very involved in, a symbol of January 6th, flying the flag upside down, those kinds of things. I think that personally, my opinion is that Supreme Court justice should be held to a standard like any other justice or judge would be in the U.S. legal system. And that is, they should recuse themselves if they have shown an interest or a connection, anything. Basically, the recusal thing is if there's a perception that you cannot make a fair assessment of a case, then perhaps they should recuse themselves. But they've never held themselves to that standard. I think it's one of the reasons that they're at a low point in people's faith and trust in the court. That's about the ethics of the money, and not reporting gifts from wealthy donors who are trying to, what appears to be, whether it is or not, the perception is that it's by your vote.
Right. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was going to be the next thing that I touched on. So I'm a big fan of John Oliver. I watch him every week pretty much. And a few months ago, he did a whole expose on Clarence Thomas, on gifts and on sort of money that was being funneled to him for the entire time he's been there, really. Trips to the Caribbean, trips all over the world, all these things. And John Oliver actually offered him, it was kind of a publicity stunt. It was probably half serious as well. Something like his salary, which is, or more than his salary, $1 million or something a year for the rest of his life.
Fundamental corruption here might be bigger than anything one recusal could cover. Because I'm not saying that Thomas is only voting the way he is because of the trips and the gifts. His opinions were horrible before he ever set foot on a yacht. But that doesn't mean those billionaires haven't had a real impact on him.
Plus a giant RV, because apparently Clarence Thomas loves traveling around in like an RV, and this is going to be a brand new one, to, retire or leave the bench and leave his position, which obviously would be in disgrace if he were to do it that way. But I'm just glad you did bring that up, because it's always been such an interesting thing for me. There's a lot of pieces of our political system that kind of don't make so much sense. One of them being this rule that the president appoints these people and then they're just there until they die, which is, we don't have any other position like that. So someone gets in there in their 40s or 50s, they could be there for 40 or 50 years, and you cannot remove them. So to that point, the whole Clarence Thomas thing, it's like, he's there, Roe v. Wade got overturned recently. All these kind of very super right-wing, religious, conservative things are being put in place. And that's where you start to understand why, the power structures are so difficult about making sure these people are in these spots, because actually it matters a lot in terms of legislation and law.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can you just kind of speak to some of that, just in terms of, because you mentioned the ethics side of the court, but just in terms of, the way they're legislating and things like that, where are we kind of right now? Where is the court right now? Because I know it is more conservative or Republican than liberal and Democrat on that court. What is the outlook of that? How does that matter in this upcoming election that we're coming up on? We're 2 days, a couple days away, or by the time this airs, the presidential debate will have aired. Can you just kind of speak to all of that?
Right. So again, on the ethics part, what I think about, because I'm not an expert on the Supreme Court or on ethics for that matter, but any lawyer who is involved in any kind of legal practice will tell you that as lawyers, we have enormous ethical obligations of every kind. And so for me, just to think about that does not extend up to the Supreme Court makes no sense to me.
Right.
They are lawyers like the rest of us are, though Supreme Court judges apparently don't have to be lawyers, but they are. And so, yes, and also because people are nominated, voted on by the Senate, but once they take their seat, they either are like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and they die in the saddle, or or they retire, but there's no accountability to the public for getting them out of that position. So what that leads to for me is that they have an enormous obligation to be concerned about the appearance of impropriety, which they're not. Now, on to your question, which is, I think you can see that we go back to 1991, and I think that what we can see is that the so-called pro-life movement, the conservative politicians could see what needed to happen in 1991. They have had a great deal of patience.
Yep.
But they got to where they wanted to go. Yeah. They got to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is where they have been directing themselves since, I don't even know when, but certainly since Clarence Thomas was on the court. And so, what we see is that where precedence used to be important, it used to be that what you would ask a Supreme Court nominee is, will you hold to the precedence that is the prior decisions of this court? And people say yes. But when the opportunity to overturn the precedent came, they were there and willing to do it. So again, I'm not an expert on either politics or the Supreme Court, but as just an observer who happens to be a lawyer and some awareness of the system, I would say, of course, that's the direction that we're going, because that's either we have to take control of the legislature and make sure that we are putting in place the kinds of political decisions that we want to see happen, or we have to start paying more attention to the Supreme Court.
Carol, thank you so much for laying all this out with us today. Seriously, you really give insight and expertise that we appreciate so much here on Unshut Cases. Again, for everyone, for our audience, Carol Murchison, New York and London, incredible attorney of counsel at McAllister Oliverius. Carol, can you tell our audience where they can find you?
Yeah, you can put my email address on your website, but it's cmurchison@mcolaw.com.
Awesome. Well, again, we just appreciate having you so much. I hope to have you back
soon.
Thank you so much.